This is the story of Ruby Bridges, written by Robert Coles and illustrated by George Ford. In the very beginning of the book, there is a message from Ruby's mother. And she says, "Our Ruby taught us a lot. She became someone who helped change our country. She was a part of history, just like generals and presidents are part of history. They are leaders, and so was Ruby. She led us away from hate. She led us nearer to knowing each other, the white folks and the black folks." So here's Ruby's story. Ruby Bridges was born in a small cabin near Tylertown, Mississippi. "We were very poor, very, very poor," Ruby said. "My daddy worked picking crops. We just barely got by. There were times when we didn't have much to eat. The people who owned the land were bringing in machines to pick the crops. So my daddy lost his job, and that's when we had to move. I remember us leaving. I was 4, I think." In 1957, the family moved to New Orleans. Ruby's father became a janitor. Her mother took care of the children during the day. After they were tucked in bed, Ruby's mother went to work scrubbing floors in a bank. Every Sunday, the family went to church. "We wanted our children to be near God's Spirit," Ruby's mother said. "We wanted them to start feeling close to Him from the very start." At that time, black children and white children went to separate schools in New Orleans. The black children were not able to receive the same education as the white children. It wasn't fair, and it was against the nation's law. In 1960, a judge ordered 4 black girls to go to 2 white elementary schools. 3 of the girls were sent to McDonough 19. 6-year-old Ruby Bridges was sent to 1st grade in the William Frantz Elementary School. Ruby's parents were proud that their daughter had been chosen to take part in an important event in American history. They went to church. "We sat there and prayed to God," Ruby's mother said, "that we'd all be strong and we'd have courage and we'd get through any trouble. And Ruby would be a good girl, and she'd hold her head up high and be a credit to her own people and a credit to all the American people. We prayed long and we prayed hard." On Ruby's first day, a large crowd of angry white people gathered outside the Frantz Elementary School. The people carried signs that said they didn't want black children in a white school. People called Ruby names. Some wanted to hurt her. The city and state police did not help Ruby. The President of the United States ordered federal marshals to walk with Ruby into the school building. The marshals carried guns. Every day for weeks that turned into months, Ruby experienced that kind of school day. She walked to the Frantz school surrounded by the marshals. Wearing a clean dress and a bow in her hair and carrying her lunch pail, Ruby walked slowly for the first few blocks. As Ruby approached the school, she saw a crowd of people marching up and down the street. Men and women and children shouted at her. They pushed towards her. The marshals kept them from Ruby by threatening to arrest them. Ruby would hurry through the crowd and not say a word. The white people in the neighborhood would not send their children to school. When Ruby got inside the building, she was all alone, except for her teacher, Mrs. Henry. There were no other children to keep Ruby company, to play with and learn with, to eat lunch with. But every day, Ruby went into the classroom with a big smile on her face, ready to get down to the business of learning. She was polite and she worked well at her desk, Mrs. Henry said. She enjoyed her time there. She didn't seem nervous or anxious or irritable or scared. She seemed as normal and relaxed as any child I'd ever taught. So Ruby began learning how to read and write in an empty classroom in an empty building. Sometimes I'd look at her and wonder how she did it, said Mrs. Henry. How she went by those mobs and sat there all by herself and yet seemed so relaxed and comfortable. Mrs. Henry would question Ruby in order to find out if the girl was really nervous and afraid, even though she seemed so calm and confident. But Ruby kept saying she was doing fine. The teacher decided to wait and see if Ruby would keep on being so relaxed and hopeful, or if she'd gradually begin to wear down, or even decide that she no longer wanted to go to school. Then one morning, something happened. Mrs. Henry stood by a window in her classroom, as she usually did, watching Ruby walk toward the school. Suddenly, Ruby stopped, right in front of the mob of howling and screaming people. She stood there facing all those men and women. She seemed to be talking to them. Mrs. Henry saw Ruby's lips moving and wondered what Ruby could be saying. The crowd seemed ready to kill her. The marshals were frightened. They tried to persuade Ruby to move on. They tried to hurry her into the school, but Ruby wouldn't budge. Then Ruby stopped talking and walked into the school. When she went into the classroom, Mrs. Henry asked her what happened. Mrs. Henry told Ruby that she had been watching and that she was surprised when Ruby stopped and talked with the people in the mob. Ruby became irritated. "I didn't stop and talk with them," she said. "Ruby, I saw you talking," Mrs. Henry said. "I saw your lips moving." "I wasn't talking," said Ruby. "I was praying. I was praying for them." Every morning, Ruby had stopped a few blocks away from school to say a prayer for the people who hated her. This morning, she forgot until she was already in the middle of the angry mob. When school was over for the day, Ruby hurried through the mob as usual. After she walked a few blocks and the crowd was behind her, Ruby said the prayer she repeated twice a day, before and after school. "Please, God, try to forgive those people, because even if they say those bad things, they don't know what they're doing. So you couldn't forgive them, just like you did those folks a long time ago when they said terrible things about you." Later that year, 2 white boys joined Ruby at the France elementary school. Their parents were tired of seeing the boys get into mischief around the house when they could have been in school and learning. The mob became very angry when the first white boys went back to school, but those boys were soon joined by other children. "We've been sitting back and letting our children get cheated out of an education because some people have tried to take the law into their own hands," one parent said. "It's time for us to fight for the side of the law and for our children's right to go to a school and get their education." They all did get their education. Ruby and a growing number of boys and girls who went to school with her. By the time Ruby was in the 2nd grade, the mobs had given up their struggle to scare Ruby and defeat the federal judge's orders that New Orleans schools be desegregated so that children of all races might be in the same classroom. Year after year, Ruby went to the France school. She graduated from it, then went on to graduate from high school. Ruby Bridges is married to a building contractor and has 4 sons who attend school within the New Orleans public school system. Now a successful businesswoman, she has created the Ruby Bridges Educational Foundation for the purpose of increasing parental involvement in schools. For further information about the foundation, write to the following address: the Ruby Bridges Foundation, Post Office Box 127, Winnetka, Illinois 60093. The end. So these are the Ruby Bridges dolls that are part of my collection. Some of these dolls were originally made to be Ruby, and others are dolls that I dressed to be Ruby Bridges. And Ruby Bridges is a little girl who was born in 1954, but in 1960 was the first African-American child to integrate the schools in Louisiana. First African-American child to integrate the William Frantz School, elementary school, during civil rights. And she went to school all year long, all by herself. And there have been many stories that have been written about her and her bravery. And so we think of her as one of the bravest little girls. That was in 1960, so this past November was the 60th anniversary of Ruby Bridges going to school alone. And so here are some dolls, some artist dolls and some regular dolls. So I will tell you about the dolls. This doll was made to reflect the picture that Norman Rockwell made called The Problem We All Live With. And you'll see that painting in a few minutes. But they called that doll Wilma, but we all know that she was the doll that was made to represent Ruby Bridges. And she's a small little, she's made out of porcelain, but she wears the white dress sort of has become a symbol of the purity of Ruby Bridges in the work that she did. Back here we have an American Girl Addie doll who was just dressed to represent Ruby Bridges. Some of the dolls in my collection are for looking only, and I always want to make sure when I have for looking only dolls, I've created a version of a doll that children can touch and hold on to. So Addie would be that doll if we were in person right now that you would be able to hold, maybe while you were reading one of Ruby Bridges' books. And here's another smaller doll. Again, just a regular 14-inch doll that I dressed that could also be Ruby, and so she's a little easier for some of the younger children to hold. Now, like Wilma or Ruby, I have two other dolls that were made recently to represent this one. This one was made by the doll artist Helen Kish, and she was made for a luncheon that the United Federations of Doll Clubs convention would have hosted last year. But because of the pandemic, we did not have the luncheon, but still the dolls were produced and some of us were able to purchase them. And this is one of my very favorite dolls that I just recently received. And this doll was crafted by the African-American Black doll artist, Karen Oyekanmi, who lives in California. And this doll is also made of porcelain. And Karen sent me pictures of the whole process of how she made Ruby and dressed her. And so hopefully we will be sharing those with you again once they've been made into a book. And this is my newest doll. Her name is Stella, and she is dressed as Ruby. Stella is called a ball jointed doll. You can see she's got all kinds of joints, and she can be moved and she can be posed, and she's made by the doll artist Connie Lowe. And I think Stella just has beautiful, soulful eyes. Love her expression. And her dress was made by a doll costumer. Her name is Mimi James. And Mimi loves to create beautiful doll dresses from older fabrics. And Stella's dress is made from an old christening gown. But you can see all of the Stellas, even though they have different facial expressions, all represent and exude the wonderful spirit and the tenacity of a young child having to face the world and help us all to understand the kind of world that we need to make so that all children have the opportunity to have a wonderful education. And this is one of the newest books that was written about her, and it's called Ruby Bridges. This Is Your Time. But there are many, many different storybooks that you can find all written about Ruby. An important part of Ruby's story that often gets overlooked a little bit in the doll world, but not so much in the story world, is the story of her teacher, Miss Henry. Miss Henry was from Boston and went to New Orleans to teach because her husband was in the service. And little did she know that she would be spending her whole year teaching one child. But it made a difference, a big difference in Ruby's life. And so I made a doll that represents Miss Henry. So there you can see the doll dressed in blue and white is my Miss Henry doll, because I really feel we should honor teachers and the important job that they have in children's lives. And Miss Henry lives right here in Boston. And many people have become more familiar with Ruby because of the silhouette that has been seen after Kamala Harris became our vice president. The picture of Ruby in the back with Kamala in the front. And the story goes that Rosa sat so that Ruby could walk, so that Kamala could lead. And so we see the pictures of Ruby and Kamala, and the Ruby in the shadow is this doll, the one that was made from the Rockwell painting, because it's really that picture of Ruby that you can see here, too, the part of the Rockwell painting of Ruby walking behind the Marshalls. That was the famous picture that this doll was made from. And then I took an American Girl doll and dressed her to represent Kamala Harris, because right now there aren't Kamala dolls. There are a couple of Kamala figurines, but I'm sure there will be a Kamala too at some point. And if you want to see the full painting, the Rockwell painting, it's over here. You can come take a look and you can see. The Rockwell painting, which is called The Problem We All Live With. So again, you can see what a brave girl Ruby Bridges was.